Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today on This Jungian Life, we wanted to talk more deeply about some of the themes that are in my upcoming book, which will be released in May of 2021. The book is entitled Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, and it's a look at how motherhood can help us grow psychologically. So one of the things that I talk about in the book quite a bit is motherhood and shadow. There's this way that parenting can really put us in touch with those aspects of ourselves that we're not so comfortable with, that we'd rather not know about. And it's very humbling, but it is very useful psychologically. So I think any process that really cooks us will do this. It's obviously not just being a mother, but that's one of the things that I wanted to look at. So we're really so delighted today to have our colleague, Puddi Kullberg, with us. Puddi is the author of the article, The Bad Mother, which appears in a 2019 volume of Psychological Perspectives. It's a really wonderful article. And we'll put a link in the show notes so that you can find that article. And we wanted to have Puddi on to talk about this because, you know, we're all bad mothers, all of us at some point. And it's very difficult to talk about this. It's very difficult to admit this. But this is part of knowing shadow. And so it's an important psychological thing to explore. So, Puddi, thank you so much for joining us.
You are so welcome. I feel privileged to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Do you want to start off by telling us a little bit about your experience of the bad mother?
Oh, dear. Yes, certainly. You know, I reread this article to get ready for the podcast today, and it is a little shocking, I have to say.
Even though it's your own article.
Even though it's my own article, it just sort of made me gasp. For those of you who don't know, first of all, I named it The Bad Mother because I wanted it to be dramatic. And I wrote it from a point of view that didn't let her off the hook. And I did that also for a reason. I wanted to make the points that are within the article clear, you know, without muddying the water. This article, I wrote this article decades after having made a decision when my children were like 16, 14, and 7, and I was in a marriage and the marriage was dissolving. I made a decision to be the one to move out of the house, and I moved to an apartment about a mile away. And I was completely unconscious, decades ago. Please remember this, decades.
Before you were an analyst and you were all individuated.
Right, before I was just all tidied up. You know, it took me quite a while to realize I might as well have moved to the moon, as, you know, the apartment a mile away. It's not quite as dire. It wasn't quite as dire, maybe, as you might imagine from reading this article. But as I said, I wanted to put a definite slant on it. Mm-hmm. So, and in the article, I use myself and I use a story from Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections of the mother who inadvertently poisoned her son. Also, examples from a novel and a couple of movies.
Mm-hmm. Of women really just being bad mothers.
Bad mothers, right. Mm-hmm. Unconscious, perhaps we could say. However, the fallout, of course, for the children is devastating. And then if the mother realizes it at a certain point, she also needs to face into that, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the point of the paper also.
Mm-hmm.
So unpacking a couple of the ideas from your paper, Puddi, can you share a few examples of how you would define the bad mother in those various examples so that the audience can get a sense of the arena that we're talking about?
So in the example from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung talks about a patient he had at the Bergholzli, a young mother who was admitted for extreme depression. And he, using his new method of dream interpretation and trying to get at what was in her unconscious, he unpacked the fact that she had inadvertently poisoned her son by dipping a rag he was going to be sucking on into poisoned water. And that was because of her depression and because she found out that the love of her life, whom she had passed over, she thought had passed over her, had abandoned her. And she had just found out that indeed that wasn't the case, that the guy had been interested in her. So, and the point Jung made, a couple of points. First of all, he must have felt she was strong enough to take it. And second of all, he let her know that this was what was in her unconscious. It did cure her depression, but of course he doesn't say what happened to her.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
I've always wondered. She went forth having to bear that burden, which is one of the points in my paper. The mother needs to take responsibility and bear the burden. Then the other example, or a couple other examples, one of the examples was from the book The Lowlands by Jhumpa Lahiri. And in it, one of the main characters abandons her daughter at a certain point, not right away, and moves off to have another life. Another example in the book is from the movie The Hours, which I just love, where the young mother in Pasadena, everything's nice and tidy. She has a son. She's overwhelmed with depression. She's reading Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and she thinks she needs to kill herself because she just can't go on. And it's being revealed that perhaps she's gay, but that's not really the real reason, or the primary reason, let's say. And she goes to a hotel, and we see this marvelous sort of fantasy dream sequence as she's reading Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and has a bottle of pills by her side she's going to take. And she can't quite get there from here. She can't do it. So she goes home and she's pregnant. She has the baby and eventually she leaves. Fast forward 20, 30 years later, maybe 40 years later. And you need to read the article to find out what happens. And then there's one other that's a little, it is as dramatic, but has a comedy feature to it. And that's from Wes Anderson's movie, The Darjeeling Limited, which is such a marvelous movie in so many ways. And Angelica Houston is the bad mother who's always leaving. Okay. She's just always leaving and ends up at a convent in the Himalayas. And her 3 sons are trying to make sense of their lives in relationship to that. And so they're on this train, the Darjeeling Limited.
I'm thinking, listening to those stories, I mean, it's not always the case, but sometimes it seems to me that we can't help but be the bad mother or the mother who leaves, because we have to take care of ourselves at times. And so whether or not it's in little ways or big, sometimes, they're little abandonments. Like, I can't read you another story tonight because I'm exhausted and I need to go to bed, that would be a little way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a lovely way to put it. That's absolutely true. And in your book, which I've had the privilege of reading, the Shadow chapters, you bring up other examples that are similar, where we can't always be the good mother.
I think every mother who is honest can recount so many times small, medium, and sometimes large abandonments of time. I know all the times as we're talking, I'm like, oh my God, I wasn't there. I didn't care. I shut things out. I put myself first. I wasn't tuned in. It goes on and on. I think it's part of the journey of being a mother. You guys can remind me who it was that said, I think it was Faye Weldon, Lisa, that you quote in your book of, I thought I was a nice person until I became a mother.
It's even better. She says the best part about not having children is you can go on thinking you're a good person.
Yeah.
You made me laugh out loud a few times reading those chapters.
Well, and we maybe need a little humor with it because it can be very heavy to recognize, as you're saying, Deb, that we're going to be the bad mother at some point,
or a lot of points.
And so, what is it like to bear that psychological burden? One of the things that's difficult is that in our culture there is a strong, I want to say, kind of valorization of the positive pole of the archetype. So as we know, every archetype is bipolar. There's the good mother and there's the bad mother. And in our culture, we're so enamored of good mother. You know, from all of those wonderful Renaissance paintings of Mary holding the Christ child to her bosom, to just, if you just go to a magazine stand and you look at parents or mothering or, you know, just kind of standard parenting magazines. I mean, there may be some humor in there about some of the minor irritations of being a mom, but there's very few discussions of the really dark stuff. And it's supposed to be, I mean, I think, you know, pregnancy, if you look at pregnancy magazines, you know, it's like everyone's supposed to be so happy and people are glowing and people are ecstatic. And in my experience, it's often very far from the case. So we have this kind of cultural vision of motherhood as being this really warm, wonderful, overwhelmingly positive thing. And there isn't a lot of room to discuss these other things. So that means that as individuals, when we're coming to terms with it, we don't have a lot of cultural containers for these feelings or experiences.
I'm thinking along two tracks. One is, yes, the valorization of motherhood as some kind of transcendent experience, combined with the falling birth rate in the United States and in other so-called first world countries. That at some level, a lot of people of childbearing age kind of get it that this might not be all that it's cracked up to be and decide not to have children. Our culture also does not support motherhood. We do not have universal child care, 100 things that actually provide ongoing substantive support for the work of child rearing. It's valorized and then good luck, you're on your own. It's your kid or children. Do it yourself. And the other is all the fairy tales, and you have lots of them in your book, Lisa, but there are lots and lots of fairy tales that point out the bad mother, represented as a stepmother, but they were originally the mothers. So somewhere this shadow is not too far under the surface, even though we don't sort of recognize it as much as we might.
I remember going to Mexico when one of my daughters was married in Mexico, and we had rented some cottages and so forth. And we had some Mexican women helping us. And when they found out that I was the mother, they just treated me as if I was the reigning beloved queen. It was so lovely and so unexpected, and certainly I don't think prevalent in our culture in the U.S.
So I'm sitting at this kind of large table where we have a lot of ideas on the table. I mean, we have these literary ideas from Puddi's paper about, let's say, the abandoning mother, whether the fantasy of abandoning through suicide or literally leaving and abandoning the children. We have the idea of shadow, which I think we have to unpack with a little more specificity, and the various ways that shadow can manifest. So when we're talking about shadow, we're talking about something that we don't know about ourselves, but is exerting an influence. And the therapeutic arc around shadow is we begin to get language for these impulses and fantasies that are rising up, and we forge a conscious relationship. So the fantasy of abandoning the children becomes an internal factor that one becomes aware of and then one struggles with. Shadow, as you were saying, can also just be rage or criticism, any of those other darker emotions which have been cut off and therefore unaware. And the young mother perhaps may be shocked that she's capable of feeling rage towards the child, or may not even know what to call this force that bubbles up. So naming it allows the mother to have a conscious relationship to it. So the first question I would just ask is, what is the value for the individual mother, to become conscious of these darker aspects versus just venting them without realizing much about them?
Well, I'll jump in there and just say that I think there are many values to it, but the one I want to lift up first is that it helps us become more whole. And the reason I want to start there is I find that so many discussions of motherhood really focus on how can I be a better mother? And that's a great conversation to have, obviously. That's very worthwhile. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that when I was raising my kids. But I think that the sort of subjectivity of the mother in that discussion gets lost. And the truth is that if the point of life, and I think we could maybe make this argument, if the point of life somehow is to become more whole, to bring forth more of what's in us, to make as much of ourselves as conscious as possible, this would be more or less Jung's idea of individuation, then being a parent is one way to learn a lot about yourself and to make stuff more conscious. So, Joseph, I really appreciate your kind of providing the frame and asking this question, but I really, as per that Faye Weldon quote, before I had kids, I really thought, I'm this sort of person and I can do this thing and I know I have these foibles, but I could never do that. I would never do that thing. And guess what? When I had kids, I did that thing. The little vignette I can give is I remember at some point, reading about shadow and thinking, what are the things I can't imagine that I don't think I have within me? And I was thinking about sadism, like taking pleasure in hurting another person. I thought to myself, I don't think I'd ever take pleasure in hurting another person. I couldn't possibly imagine enjoying hurting another person. And then, my daughter was probably about 18 months old and I was, exhausted and sleep deprived and everything. And I was giving her bath at the end of the day, and it had been an incredibly long day. And she was being really fussy about, it was too hot, it was too cold. I think she was complaining it was too hot, too cold, and then she was complaining it was too hot. And at some point, I made it like a little too cold and dumped it over her head, and she squealed. And I enjoyed that moment, and I thought, oh, okay, I get it. I can be sadistic. So, Joseph, just to bring it back, like that's an incredibly valuable experience to know that I have that within me, just as a person. Now, does being aware of those things also make me a better mother? Yes, I think it does. But there's value in it purely from the standpoint of the psychological growth of the mother, too.
Well, it occurs to me that Jung was very interested in the shadow, but he also referred to it as the confrontation with the shadow, a kind of standoff with the shadow discoveries. So, for instance, in the example with the cold water, if you don't mind my asking, you become aware of that, like you said, small sadistic gesture. How did you have a standoff with that in yourself?
Well, I think it was just, I had to recognize that capacity within me. And that was really humbling. I mean, that changes the nature of the ego to say, ah, yes, and that too. So, in some sense, it's a relativization of the ego because I had to say, yeah, I have that within me and I can't control it. I can't ego it away. It's there.
And you have a good example of this as well, this confrontation, because some people must not let it become conscious, or else they split it off. You had the example about the woman with the aggression and her child. Do you want to? I think you'd probably speak to it a little more clearly than I could. Do you remember this example from your book? The mother had had a very difficult childhood with a lot of abuse, and she had apparently made a decision that she would not allow aggression in her life. And she taught her little girl that. As I recall from your book, you were there visiting the kids, your daughter and her daughter, and when the mother went upstairs, her daughter pushed your daughter down. So that mother split it off. She did not confront it like you did.
That's a great example, Puddi. So she had as I understand, she'd had a very difficult childhood, and she had promised herself she would never speak harshly with her daughter. She told me this, and I was like, wow, because I was like speaking harshly to my daughter like every day. I was like, wow, that's really impressive. And she, always was just this sort of font of calmness and serenity. And she, really did it. She said it took tremendous kind of ego composure to not lose her temper, but that she never had. And so we were visiting, and like you said, the mom went upstairs and the little girl pushed my daughter. And I said, oh, don't push or something to this little girl as the mother was coming back down. And the mother said to me, oh, she doesn't push. And I thought, okay, so all of the aggression has really gone underground, and it can't be named, it can't be seen, but it's there acting. So you're right, Puddi. That's a good example to bring up, because there's a way that when we can deal with our own shadow, then we're not projecting it out there. We're not projecting it onto our kids. And in a sense, we're setting our kids up for eventual permission for them to make contact with their shadows too.
Versus denial and splitting off. Yeah.
And that's the hard part, is shadow will be there. Basically, the only choice we have is whether to recognize it and integrate it consciously, or let it go underground the way that it did in the example you just gave. It was there anyway. It's going to be there. It's just a question of what we do with it.
I think it bears discussion, the difference between an internal recognition of shadow or antisocial impulses and the process by which that can either be concretized or that can be kind of psychologized. Because I think that's the thin thread that we're always kind of standing on when we're talking about shadow. So I think all of us that are doing inner work are certainly trying to track shocking fantasies that we may have, and having to admit that these fantasies are in fact psychoactive parts of our own soul. Often in dreams, we will behave or commit actions or observe other parts of our psyche committing actions which are shocking to the conscious mind. And those have to be claimed, that at least in a nodal way, this represents something that is inside of me.
I really like that you use the word surprised and shocking, because that is one mechanism by which we become aware of the shadow. Like when Lisa realized as she's dumping the cold water, like, oh, I did. She was surprised. It caught her attention. Or as you're saying, our fantasy life or in dreams, when we aspects of us perform shocking behaviors. It gets our attention if we're paying attention.
As we're talking, so many memories and memories of feeling arise in me. My children are well grown. I have grandchildren, and I'm back there when my kids were little, and I was so often just at the end of my rope. I really had not expected motherhood to slam me up against my own shadow so profoundly, so repeatedly, so powerfully. I was really surprised by the exhaustion, by my own limitations, by my temper, by the tears that I shed so often at the end of the day. I don't know how anybody does it. It happens that I had twins. I really was not expecting to be so depleted so much of the time. And so as we're talking about, the bad mother, I'm thinking, well, it's not that just happens. It happens because taking care of 2 infants, 2 toddlers, 2 little kids is that hard. And there are very, very few supports, including just the acknowledgement that this is that hard. And most people lack any kind of acknowledgement, recognition, or material support. And that I think is making me feel a little teary right now. So I think I just want to say to all you mothers out there, we get it.
I want to take this just one step further because, Deb, you're saying it's just that hard and that's why it happens. And I want to lift up the possibility that maybe it also happens because it's just natural. And you can't just have the positive pole of the archetype. You will always have to have the negative pole also. And when one pole gets constellated, Joseph, as you'll often say in the podcast, the other pole gets constellated in the unconscious. So I'm thinking about this other really great article that I read around the same time that I read yours, Puddi, by Daniela Seif. And I want to say it's called The Death Mother.
Mm.
But she just makes this brilliant point that kind of anthropologically, it is common in, I guess, hunter-gatherer societies, and probably always has been common, that mothers would kill certain of their children. She has this just some incredible stories. If you've got a small child and there's no birth control and you get pregnant again and you carry that baby to term and there's not enough food for that small child that you already have, this apparently is something that's pretty commonly done, is you dispatch that baby upon birth. And it's a terrible, terrible thought. but the possibility that is something that exists in the psyche, that capacity says, well, this is just part of it. This is just part of it. And I want to say that, I do talk about this in the book in relation to the story that you just asked me to go over, Puddi, that I think that there is possibly quite a bit of good in being able to hold aggression with our children. I'm not advocating yelling at your kids, but maybe what I'm saying is if you do find yourself doing that maybe there's a benefit to it. Maybe we're helping our children learn how to hold and manage their aggression, or at least showing them that when someone really loses it, that we can come back and there can be a repair.
That seems really significant. And I also find myself, for some reason, wanting to parse out these titles. I mean, there is a distinction between the imperfect mother compared to the cultural fantasies versus the bad mother or the dangerous mother. Or we go to Winnicott's The Good Enough Mother, which is, I think, what we're talking about. And those qualities are quite different. I don't think we're saying that any mother should cross a certain line and become the dangerous mother, although she may feel dangerous and have to acknowledge that. But there are certain lines that, at least in modern culture, cannot be crossed because there is an unrecoverable space that anyone can move into. So I think we're talking about these kind of transgressions against the fantasy mother that are normal and natural, that are not spoken enough about, and require both perhaps a normalization of it so that it can be held consciously, but also a frame of understanding so that these impulses can be canalized in a certain way. I mean, for instance, aggression can be expressed in many different ways. When it's unconscious, we tend to aggress it in a rather impulsive or primal way, mostly because we don't know about it. But I think the hope would be some of these initial discoveries will then be able to take on a more sophisticated or more aesthetic expression.
I want to take us back to the idea of repair, which is critical in all kinds of trauma theory. The acknowledgement consciously of this happened and I did this. I recognize it. I'm sorry. I'm confronting myself and I'm communicating it to you. And I would like to make a repair, that I care and I'm here and I'm sorry and I take responsibility for it. And the other thing I would like to say is around aggression and anger is a wise woman taught me about exploding up. And I have always loved that. You throw your hands in the air, scream and shout, stamp your feet, say, I am furious. I am so mad. And then it is not directed at a person, but you get the feelings out. I just couldn't resist a practical tip.
Yeah, no, that's lovely, Deb. Joseph, I thank you for doing that, for helping us parse this, and for bringing in Winnicott's Good Enough Mother, and that's obviously related to what you were talking about, Deb, about repair, and it is so important. I mean, I think these ruptures and repairs are what build up differentiation, build up ego, and so per Winnicott's point, if you're not familiar with that, one of the things he's basically saying is, it would be terrible to have a perfect mother, because then that space wouldn't be created where the child could learn his or her own differentiation from the mother and how to take on some of these ego functions, that it's in those ruptures and repairs that happens. And there's some good evidence from neurobiology that that's exactly the case, that Winnicott really had it right. I want to say further about your point about dangerous. Of course, we can't be dangerous mothers. We can't cross that line, and that's not okay. And we're condemning that and all that. And I just am, again, going back to the subjective experience that even when we're not being a dangerous mother, we can feel like we are the bad mother. It really feels awful to feel like you're the bad mother. And so I think I am interested in kind of penetrating into that and saying, okay, so what about that? And what if we are the bad mother in some way? And Puddi, this kind of goes back to your paper about having to bear that. And I'm wondering if you would feel comfortable talking a little bit about your own experience of, having, if you will, abandoned your children. And then what have you had to bear, and what has that meant for you?
Yes, I wouldn't have volunteered when you asked me to come if I wasn't ready to speak about this. But you also need to understand, you can hear me getting choked up. Sometimes it still evokes emotion. And I've always wanted to say this. So I'm going to start on a happier note. My children have turned out to be spectacular. And I'm so proud of them. And I have good relationships with them. But to back it up, for me personally, I was in a lot of remorse for many years. I would say, honestly, 15 years. Just grave remorse, which looking back on it, it was what it was, but it clouds the field because then you're looking through a cloud at your children, at yourself, at your life, even if it's not conscious to you. And it's not really all that helpful. But then a day came when I realized because I did start to go at some point to therapy. I am involved in a 12-step program. I, began to take responsibility for my part in this at a certain point. And that's when psychologically things start to change for you. I would say, as I have explained a little in the paper, it sets you apart. Bad mother is an isolating experience. There is no 12-step program for bad mothers that I know of anyway, right? You can't go in and say, oh my God, I did this. Maybe abusive mothers, but that was, I didn't abuse them in a overt, physical way. There is that feeling of isolation and it mitigates your joy, of being a mother because it's now clouded. And that took me a long time to get over. And as Deb has mentioned, being a grandmother has brought a lot of it back to me and allowed me to re-experience and uncloud those moments of joy that I did have with my children. In the long run, what you gain is something along the lines of what you're talking about in the shadow chapters, Lisa, in your book. It does broaden your feeling and capacity for just being a regular human being. Oh my God, I've done this thing, which cannot be repaired. Well, it can and cannot sometimes, but it's unknown if it can be repaired. And yet I'm still living. And am I going to choose to keep living? Am I going to make the choice? And if I am, then I need to get on with it and experience the full range of human emotion. I had an incident lately with my younger daughter. We were talking about something, it was Jungian related. She was helping with the tech on a webcast. And later on, we were discussing some of the content. And I said to her, it really was poignant for me, this incident that was pointed out, because it reminds me that you were 6 when I left. And I know that you used to sit under the tree outside and read. And it just felt so poignant that you were alone without me in the house and you were reading under the tree. And she said to me, Mom, and I was trying once again to make amends in a small way when you can, sort of titrate it. And she said, I said, so your feelings about the tree in the house and being left. And she goes, but Mom, when you were there still, and then even afterwards, there were many moments of joy. So I wouldn't choose this path for anyone. I mean, I've never murdered someone, although, it could have been a soul murder. Yeah, I think you could say. But it does make you more understanding, maybe, and compassionate.
It enlarges you.
It's a huge topic of how to bear something.
Yes.
What it takes to bear any of shadow elements that we might have. It always calls up to me a lot of mythological material, especially Persephone's abduction into the underworld. And she was down there, depending on the version, for 3 months or 6 months. What did she do all day down there? And so there's an internal conscious, unconscious process of coming to terms with something that has happened and that you can't change.
Yes.
I'm just really aware of what it has taken, for you and for many people to bear things and come into a consciousness that I think is incredibly valuable and hard won, as you have.
Well, thank you. As I've said, and it's been remarked here, I don't want to valorize the bad mother in any way, but it has been, I guess we could say, a journey that's a little trite for me and my family. One part I didn't bring up is getting through the shame. I guess, that's the alienating factor. And I just think with enough work and analysis, and so on and so forth. You wake up one day and it's mostly not a shame. You're not ashamed anymore. It's just part of being the human being that you are.
Does it lead to just a grief and a regret? I know that's what I experience of the things that I look back on, especially in this conversation today, of like, oh my God, I really wish I hadn't done that. I wish I had been different. I wish I had been more conscious.
Oh, absolutely. I'm reading Lisa's book and going, oh my God, why couldn't I have had this book,
Yeah.
or come across it? As all you listeners probably know, there are stages in your life where it gets brought back to you. As a grandparent, I was out helping my daughter, and her daughter at that point was 6. Okay. It dawned on me, this is the age that I left.
Oh, gosh.
And I thought I was going to just die. I mean, seriously, I did not, I contained it, but it did bring it absolutely starkly home to me, the magnitude of what I had done. So then you bear that. But I got help in bearing it. Maybe that we should also say that, right? I got help in 12-step programs. I got help in analysis. I got help wherever I could find it at a certain point to bear the grief.
One thought, Puddi, beyond what Lisa and Deb have said, has to do with the relativization of what we think of as our mistakes and whether or not there is a negative inflation. So one of the ways that I think the ego tries to not repeat something which was pain creating is by manufacturing a kind of buttress around it. And one of the ways we do that is we tend to expand the blighting impact of our mistakes. And as analysts, we are often working with our clients to create a more reality-based analysis of the actions they've taken. So what an important experience for you to hear from your daughter that moments of joy existed while you were in the household and moments of joy continued after you were no longer in the household, that the fantasy of having blighted her life was lifted. And it was lifted by getting more facts around the situation. And I think particularly for the parent that steps away from the family or the marriage, there is a void of progressive facts about the children because one is not there. And that leaves us only with a kind of tortured fantasy of what might be happening or what might have happened. So, which goes to a corollary I have that, facts are medicinal. Reality is medicinal.
I love that you brought this up. When you started with a negative inflation, the terminology negative inflation, that was brought to my attention in my psychological work around this. I am the worst person on the face of the earth. No mother could be worse than me, which is, I loved your language, Joseph, a buttress to just the actual reality of the situation. I presented my paper at a conference of the interregional analysts. I had images from the sources that I've cited, the films I've cited, and more or less what is in the paper. And at the end, I had such an unexpected reaction from my colleagues and peers. One by one, people stood up. Like one person stood up, men and women, to speak to the absence, I believe, of Joseph, what you brought up, and said, I was a bad mother, or I was a father who left. Or one fellow got up and, when he had sort of seen the objective that it wasn't about the children, it was about the mother. He is an adult man, got up and looking from his childhood perspective, he said, I guess I need to call my mother. Right? And so I was left with this overwhelming response and support, I guess. So I really love your observations here, Joseph. Thank you.
And part of the healing support was an affirmation that you are understandable and that what you have experienced is understandable, even though there is an admixture of both suffering and individuation, as it is for many of us. And that's something that people come to analysis for, is that what you have experienced and you yourself can be known. I would like to take a little pivot as the only male in the group and offer another perspective on the idea of the bad mother. Because as a man, I have also absorbed the bad mothering behaviors from my own home where I was raised. And so men are also having to both confront and make sense of their inner bad mother, which can show up in a lot of ways. A man who has internalized a bad mother may have no sense of how to care for his body or to be nurturing even to the pets in the house or nurturing to their own children. They may not know how to tend the house that they're living in, as bachelors, that the mothering impulses inside of them either offer them no support, that their inner mother has kind of abandoned them, or gives them bad advice. So one of the paths for men is also being able to name, to sort through, and to evaluate their own internal mother, and to add something positive to that, to pick up the slack so that they can mother themselves adequately, and then not necessarily force that upon the women in their lives.
Well, Joseph, I appreciate you bringing in that perspective. And of course, there's so much about mothering that calls up for us our experience with our own mothers. So in some sense, this is like a companion episode to the negative mother complex episode, because, to the extent that we had a negative experience with our own mother, it can make mothering that much more difficult for us. And so motherhood is just filled with all kinds of psychological challenges and opportunities to come to terms with stuff, both in the present and from the past. It's a very big topic, but I just want to maybe finish by saying that I do think that there is real hope here in terms of being given an opportunity to do psychological work that you maybe wouldn't get to the same degree in other places in your life. Jung said you can't individuate on top of a mountain. And he talked at times about really needing to be with other people to stir things up. In fact, apparently he started the psychological club in Zurich, partly to give the analysans and other people in his circle a way to come together so that there would be this kind of friction where they'd rub up against each other, and these complexes would get constellated and you'd have to figure it all out, right? And there can be something really difficult about being in a group, which we all know, those of us that have been involved in any Jungian organization can attest to that. There's something really difficult about being in a relationship or a family. It's the same thing, and it's messy, but it's also, there's so much gold there. So I hope that mothers in particular can be reassured that some of this messiness and even ugliness is normal and perhaps beneficial both to you and hopefully also your kids. So
would you remind us, I'm just going to be flagrant here about promoting your book, that your book is coming out, I think, around May 15th, mid-May?
It's actually coming out May 25th, 2021. Okay. It's published by Sounds True, and it's available for pre-order now. And it won't be long before it's out in the world too. So,
and the title is
Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself. My author website is lisamarciano.com, and you can pre-order the book there and sign up for my mailing list and read an excerpt and even sign up for a free email course. And now you can also find my page, my author page, if you go to thisjungianlife.com as well.
And also for our listeners, Puddi Kullberg is a Jungian analyst in private practice in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And you can find her at her website, puddi.com. That's PUDDI.com.
Thank you, Joseph.
And all this information will be in the show notes. Just scroll down and you will find it all there. And with that, I think we may pivot to a dream.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Our dreamer this week is a woman who's 36 years old. She's a mother of 2 and a psychologist with a Jungian orientation. Here's the dream. I climb a gigantic rock. In the carrier on my belly, I carry my son. I am trying to reach the tree that stands solely on top of the rock, which feels like the ceiling of the world. The tree is bigger than any tree I have ever seen. It is, in fact, so big I feel it to be the world tree. I am desperate to reach it, for I feel I need to be there. It is essential. The tree is wildly moving its gigantic trunk from left to right all around its circumference. There is no wind, so I feel it must be moving from itself. Its crown is damaged by what seems to have been lightning. It feels overwhelming how big the tree is. I know that I have to reach the base of the tree when it's moving its trunk into the other direction. Although there is a risk of its branches hitting me and my baby, I know there is a certain time span for me to quickly reach its base before the trunk will change direction again. Suddenly, there is a figure that attacks me as I climb upwards. He hits and tries to throw me off the mountain. It feels like he is from space, for he has a strange appearance, metallic-like. I know I will have to fight him. It is too important to reach the tree. I feel a sense of overcoming this figure, but there is no real image of that. I am very aware of my baby on my belly during the fight. End of dream. And for significance, our dreamer says that at the time of the dream, 1.5 years ago, her son, her firstborn, was 9 months old. His birth was a major impact on her life, and she was struggling with sleep deprivation and depression, for her baby had some sleeping problems and she was feeding through the night. She also struggled and continues to struggle with feelings of loneliness, as she feels she's not able to live up to her deepest felt and mostly spiritual tendencies. The main feelings in the dream, she says, were hardship, effort, determination, longing, and focus. And she also adds that the image of the tree is recurrent in her dreams and that most of the time it's a pine tree.
Well, I just want to start off by saying that I knew our topic today, and I obviously knew Puddi was joining us, and I went to pick the dream this morning, and this one was at the top of the pile.
Oh, my goodness.
So it had actually just come in, a few minutes before I checked.
A Jungian moment, for sure.
We love those.
Yes, we do.
Well, I'd like to move to an archetypal amplification to frame the dream to begin with. So, as you were reading the dream, I was thinking about the Maori myth of Tane Mahuta, which is something that Edinger brings up in the history and development of consciousness, but I had come across in some of my other reading. So, in that myth, which I believe comes out of New Zealand, in the beginning of the world, the Great Mother and the Great Father are in such a tight union that no other life is possible. The children cannot be born, animals, creatures, the earth cannot exist because the mother and the father are so intensely conjoined. One of the offspring in that lifeless space is their son, Tane Muhuta, who grows enough strength to be able to pry the cosmic parents apart, to pry the sky and the earth apart, and forever maintain that tension within which all manifest life can then exist. In the ancient forests, they will often find the largest of the trees, these kind of enormous trees that are representative or believed to be Tane Muhuta. So I'm thinking about this woman with her, 9-month-old son and her own experience of the constellation of the mother and father, the parental archetypes, and the tension between feeling that those archetypes are closing in, are taking all the space and not allowing any other life to be there, and the great tree that strains to pry open a space where she can continue to be alive and hold the tension between the cosmic father and the cosmic mother, that the psychological life of the son can have that space, that she, as a human being and not just a mother, also has space between those forces. It then brings to question the negative or attacking masculine force. And I would interpret that as the interference with that space, that the cosmic father and the cosmic mother do not want to be apart. They want to uproot the tree and collapse all of space-time back into their constant union. So to me, the masculine, the attacking metallic masculine figure is out picturing the struggle to maintain the life of the tree that creates any space in her psyche for her own individual self.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wasn't familiar with that story, Joseph, and I feel like that you're definitely leaning into something there. I think I'm having a fantasy in a sort of slightly different direction about this dreamer, and it for me, I mean, the tree is obviously such a big symbol, and it can hold so much. And she says it's kind of the world tree, which one of the things about the world tree is it kind of connects the levels. It connects the earthly with the spiritual, this kind of axis mundi role. Now, this is a very interesting tree because it's moving dynamically, which is an image that shows up in some fairy tales, actually. But I'm thinking about the tree as an image of the mother. Sometimes it's associated with that. In the Grimm's version of Cinderella, there's no fairy godmother, but the Cinderella's mother has been buried out back, and on her grave is planted a bush or a small tree, and Cinderella goes to that tree to seek advice and succor. And I'm thinking, Puddi, of your daughter sitting underneath the tree after you left, sort of finding the good mother. So I wonder if in some way she's, part of the fantasy I think that I'm having is maybe she's attempting to find that good mother place as she attempts to mother her son in what sounds like a state of depletion and isolation. I'm also aware that the tree can be a symbol of the self, and it, having that connection with that, it's like having a kind of a compass that directs us toward what is right. And this is a real struggle to come into contact with that.
Well, I love both these interpretations. Joseph, I was just agog and imagining the situation that you were portraying. And then Lisa, this other point of view is so interesting as well. If this was my dream, I think I would consider it a big dream. I would consider it positive because there is a sense of urgency. She said there's some time span involved, but it seems like that she feels she will overcome or get around the obstacle of this figure who is alien and masculine. So there is a sense of success, I would say, from the reading. And just on a very more concrete, personalistic note, I mean, here she is, sleep deprived, exhausted, lonely. And this dream may be giving her some hints that underneath all that, she's going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
I am taken with the images of both the tree and the metallic figure that seems to be from space, of that both of these are really difficult images. The tree is moving all around. This is a pretty aggressive kind of tree that can move and sway, and she has to reach the base of the tree when it's moving its trunk in the right direction, or its branches could hit her and the baby. This tree has been perhaps struck by lightning because the crown is damaged. And then this man from space who's trying to throw her off the mountain. So I'm aware that there is a tremendous sort of tumult being pictured in the dream and in the dreamer's psyche, with her parenting of her firstborn, struggling with feeding and sleep. And where I want to go with the tree is that in her comments, she says it's a recurring image and that most of the time it's a pine tree.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what is significant about a pine tree? Well, there's a lot of pine tree in mythology and in painting and depiction. It's apparently a favorite subject of Chinese and Japanese painters because of its hardiness. It stays green. No matter what, it's green. And that it's become a symbol of long life, immortality, constancy, courage, strength in adversity, and steadfastness. And I'm reading this from the Book of Symbols, and that's its title. It has a hand image on the cover, and you can find it on Amazon. The pine cone also has so many seeds, and pine cones are hardy. So, picking up on your idea, Puddi, that basically this is an encouraging dream. The way is hard. Adversity is part of it, but the tree prevails.
These are complex images. I mean, I'm aware that I don't think this is a pine tree, so it changes things a bit, but you're right, Deb. She says she mostly dreams of pines, and that makes me think of the myth of Attis.
Yes.
Who sacrifices himself to the mother on a pine tree. So that's a very different, maybe that's almost more harkening back to Joseph, your archetypal interpretation about kind of what's moving in the unconscious. I want to say, she says the tree is kind of at the ceiling of the world in this dream. So I'm curious about the kind of up and down here. She's climbing a big rock. And then there's lightning that has struck the tree, and there's this metallic man from space. So there's something coming from up above. And I'm curious if there's a relationship. My fantasy is that somehow the lightning and the metallic man are related. Maybe they represent some kind of too hypertrophied thinking function, perhaps, or a kind of a spiritual function that hasn't been well integrated. And the tree itself, of course, connects this upper realm with the below, and that's its potent function.
Is there a sense in the dream? Anybody have a sense of why she needs to reach the tree? Like what's driving her?
Where I go with that is to build on what you were saying, Lisa, about the hypertrophied kind of thinking or spiritual function. That somehow she has to go up, somehow she has to confront this sort of wild tree and the metallic man, maybe from space, and the lightning. And I'm also, this may really be a reach, but I'm going into the myth of Attis that you referenced. Attis and his mother were, we would say today, enmeshed.
Yeah, you could say that.
His mother loved him. And when he got involved with somebody else, his mother was a goddess. He eventually castrated himself and died beneath a pine tree. And I'm wondering about the bond with her 9-month-old baby, although she says in the context that she's a mother of 2, that this intensity of the bond of mothering. And I'm starting to wonder about, her nursing him through the night with sleep problems, of whether there's been a gigantic effort to be the good mother here, to meet his every need. I'm remembering when my 2 newborns, I don't know, 3 or 4 months old, I did everything I could so that they didn't cry. And finally, one night, I was so exhausted that despite both of them crying, I simply fell asleep. I just basically kind of passed out. And so this is a sort of a loose chain of associations on my part, perhaps, but I'm wondering about her mothering and what may be imaged here in the dream about that.
And then the man from space might be a kind of positive image of something else that needs to come in. You could see how we're walking all around this and we're not really landing, but I think any of these are really intriguing things. The other myth that comes up for me with your story, Deb, or where you're going, is the story of Ganesh. Because Ganesh's mom, and I'm not, Joseph, maybe you can help me. I'm not remembering the names of the parents right now, but she's enmeshed with her new baby, Ganesh, and asks him to set a watch while she's bathing. And the father comes home and doesn't know his own kid. Ganesh won't let him into his mom's bath. And so the dad whacks off his head and kills him, and then replaces his head with an elephant's head and that sort of thing. But to me, it is an image of how the father principle needs to come in and to a certain extent kind of separate mom from this intense attachment, from this too intense attachment.
I somehow think that's right on. And what I have just remembered is my husband barring the door to my crying babies, and how awful and cruel I thought that was.
Oh, God.
And how necessary it was. That by 10 or 10:30 at night, it's just got to be over for the day. So somehow we've all drifted here. And whether this feels right to the dreamer or not, we can't know. But I am noting the direction that our discussion has taken us.
Thank you, everyone here. And I have another idea, which is a little tangent. Joseph brought up why she's so desperate to reach the tree. And an idea I had was that I believe she has had a potent spiritual life prior to having children. And maybe she's concerned that she can't carry that on, with little ones, her spiritual practices, her spiritual connection. Maybe she's concerned that that's going to somehow get broken, and she doesn't want it to be broken. She hopefully will find out, as many of us have found out, that you can still have a spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual life alongside of children. It just might look a little different, or maybe the reality of it is the spiritual life at this point.
And in fact, it might be that the process of mothering deepens your spirituality.
There we go. Yeah.
Writing on that, Puddi, I had a thought about this tree as the Kabbalistic tree of life.
Of course.
And particularly because in that model, there is something called the path of the lightning flash.
Oh.
That this is called Mesla, but this transcendental awakening force strikes the top of the tree and zigzags down to its roots, and which both creates the universe, but also for the initiate has the potential to activate them in a psycho-spiritual way. So as you were saying, Puddi, as she's fighting her way back to the tree of life, ostensibly to put herself back on the path upward, there is the inner adversary that tries to turn her back. And it could be the inner adversary that says you don't have time, you don't have the space, you really just need to focus everything on being a new mom, etc., etc. But that she has to fight her way back to this reevaluation of her spiritual path. And in some ways, that makes it more valuable, that she has to put on a certain kind of muscle and she has to own a certain amount of aggressive potential to be able to lay hold to her spirituality again, which I think is similar to what you were saying, Puddi.
Yeah, that's great. What an interesting dream. We really had fun with this one today, didn't we?
Fabulous.
Mm.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.